A single drone was sent to investigate the signal we had found. From what we could make out, it was a distress signal, repetitive loops echoing out. If it were so, the drone should in theory be able to provide basic assistance, at least until we could get a manned vessel there. If it proved to be a trap, then we would at least only lose something minor. It was the best we could do, the wounds we had received flaring up once more at the contact. When it came upon the site, it seemed more apparent that it was a legitimate signal. A sleek 100-meter ship floated aimlessly, a patch of its exterior blackened and jagged. From the look of it, something inside had ruptured, knocking them out of whatever path they were on. A basic scan showed 5 life forms on board. They were spread around and clearly moving. As for what races they were, it was unclear. They were small and stocky from the readings we received. A quick discussion occurred on what we should do. A minority proposed using them as practice for our warships. They saw all aliens as the enemy rather than specifically the Zyvarg. Thankfully, their voices, whilst loud, weren't numerous. Instead, it was decided to provide assistance. If it turned out they were directly responsible, then we would make sure they disappeared. If not, then we had a good way into the center. With it in mind, the Gus Wolf was deployed. During its passage, the drone made itself know. With our limited understanding of their language, we did our best to broadcast a message of peace. Thankfully, the essence came through, and unmistakable tones of gratitude were received. Relying heavily on pictures, they showed what we thought. Part of their ship had seriously malfunctioned, basically killing their engines and what looked like the main reactor. They were relying on backup whilst attempting to make repairs. With permission, we used the drone to nudge them towards the Genesis 3 colony. Compared to the distance needed to go, it was a futile gesture. But it at least gave the appearance of assistance. All the while, Gus Wolf was on its way. Soon enough, our first ship arrived. It initially raised alarms as they panicked at the sight of a clearly armed ship. But before they could do anything rash, Wolf gave a similar message of peace. With it there, the situation rapidly improved. A launch bay was isolated and their crippled ship was gently towed in. Wolf took over the translation efforts, quickly improving on our lexicon. By the time they were safely stowed, we could talk in simple terms. In the apparent interests of safety, we requested information on their genetics to ensure a lack of disease being able to jump the species gap. However, whilst it was a significant part, that wasn't the only reason. The more we knew about them, the better if things turned sour. They were more than willing to help. As we connected then to the Wolf's power supply, they prepared a mass upload from their medical systems. It covered not only them but all species, and even as they sent it, we set up a live feed to truly see them. What we saw were maybe half-meter-tall isopods. 3 large antennae sprouted from the tops of their heads, moving constantly as they spoke. They had a pair of compound eyes, below which sat a small mouth. Either side were 2 slits, which they apparently used to breathe. Down their backs ran a segmented shell in various shades of cyan. Their fronts were primarily a darker blue, lightening as it traveled along their limbs. They boasted 6 arm appendages topped with 4-fingered hands with a dozen legs beneath them. These were the Quelon. Comparing their physiology to ours, we quickly worked out disease would be exceedingly unlikely to jump the gap. They soon after agreed, seeing the results we produced. With a sense of importance, Captain Harris welcomed them aboard as they exited their craft. They were delighted to meet us, and we did our best to return it. A couple of our engineers worked with them to inspect their ship, trying to locate all issues. We quickly worked out their FTL drive had suffered a critical overheat. It caused an overload, making itself a vent by blowing open part of the ship. This cascaded down their systems, causing their engines to shut down and the reactor to turn off in case of catastrophic failure. That made sense to us. However, what we failed to comprehend was why these shutoffs would require the ship to be docked to reverse. Maybe in densely populated space it would work, but here it made no sense. Putting aside our disbelief, we towed them to the colony. An order was placed for as close to replacement parts as possible to be delivered to the colony. All the while we piled them with questions on the galactic stage. To them it looked like we were eager to join and meet our fellows from across the stars. We actively hid our true intent, letting them come to that conclusion. They gave us as much as they could, even allowing. Our shipyards were a hive of activity. Throughout all hours of the day, refined materials were brought in. Construction progressed as fast as possible, delays simply not allowed to happen. Over Mars, the skeleton of the first Vengeance ship was put in place. Its size was awe-inspiring. Just from the structure, it promised to be more than 3 times the size of the ships that started our quest. Once completed, it would stand nearly 20 kilometers long. Enormous armaments were being constructed, to be attached to the frame once completed. Its shields would be top-tier, powered by a dedicated reactor. The Quelon individuals knew nothing of this. From our discussions with them, it soon became apparent they were relieved by the fact we had saved them. Not only that, they were excited to introduce us to the galactic stage. Whilst we were known about, being the first to have proper contact would ensure their names went down in history. We played the part of an eager young race, acting as enthusiastic hosts. We treated them like royalty, giving them a sample of our products to consume. Our engineers worked hard to fix their broken drive, whilst making note of any interesting systems we hadn't used. Replacement parts were accompanied by diplomats from the Union, who proceeded to meet and greet all 5. It looked to be all sunshine and rainbows to them. We had some difficulty with their names being a series of clicks and whistles, but with their blessing we gave them nicknames to ease communication, as close to their names as we could. The captain, Switzel, was the main focus, being their leader. She told us they were a group of travelers who had taken it upon themselves to explore this section of the galaxy for interesting planets. Her crew was made of a navigator called Kletch, a geologist named Zetnik, and a pair of part archivists, part general scientists, known as Floonbit and Daintiz. They loved everything we showed them, delighted at how alien we were to anything they had known. In short order, their ship was ready. They were almost sad at the prospect of having to leave us behind. But the sorrow soon faded, as they extended an invitation for us to follow them in a ship to reach the assembly. It was an offer we were hardly going to refuse. Gus Wolf volunteered to accompany them. The Union were swift to approve the choice. As Wolf had been instrumental in creating a fully functioning translation software, it was in the prime position to adapt it with other races' ways of speaking, knowing it intimately. Besides that, although rare, there was a risk of pirates. The last thing we wanted was to lose our ticket into their assembly. As they told us most ships were small, we assumed Gus Wolf could handle them. Spinning up FTL drives, the pair of ships departed in the direction of their core of civilization. The travel would take just over a month due to the size of their drive. We didn't complain, being more than happy to have more time to prepare. Achilles had taken their star charts, linking them to our own. We found that we had a significant buffer of empty worlds between us. From what we had been told, most races were slow to colonize. Most would only do a couple at a time, focusing resources in a few places. Our way of automating the process was different and far more efficient. We could easily fill much of the buffer, expanding our controlled space. Eve looked through their medical data. Using it as a guide, she made a virtual copy of each race. Coordinating with Achilles, they made an initial training simulation for our military. Using logical leaps in how their bodies moved, they could show an estimation of how a close-quarters fight would go. They highlighted key weaknesses they had noticed, ones that they thought would likely be covered in armor. Recorded instances of the Quelon were scrutinized. They seemed like good folks, ones who we wouldn't want to fight for no good reason. But we couldn't trust them not to get involved when the hammer fell. So we used it as a base of psychological understanding, seeing tells in how they spoke, seeing how easy or difficult it would be to break them. We really hoped it wouldn't come to that. Gus Wolf powered on throughout the month's travel. The crew prepared non-stop. They trained constantly, keeping themselves in top condition. When not training, they studied what was known. They cleaned the ship relentlessly, striving to make a good first impression. When they came out of FTL, all eyes watched a feed from the bow of the ship. A binary star system sat before them. Gracefully orbiting them in a figure of 8 was an ornate space station. It was comprised of 2 large rings, with spokes linking to an axle between them. It was coated in gold, with a multitude of shining ships moving to and from it. Captain Switzel sent a simple message, oozing with joy. "This is Assembly Station, the center of our great collective." Gus Wolf let the Quelon ship lead the way. As unhappy as we were with this collective, We weren't yet confident of victory. Appearing near their apparent center with a warship probably wasn't the best way to give a message of peace. Letting them go before us would let them ease the way. Captain Switzel fully understood the reasoning. She readily flew before us, opening a channel to the station. Wolf patched itself in, recording and relaying it to the crew after translating. Hopeful Wanderer to Assembly Station. We read you, Hopeful Wanderer. Please send permit codes. Sending now. We are also accompanied by an unregistered vessel from a new species. Received. Please repeat, a new species vessel? Even through the translation, it was easy to hear the joy in Switzel's voice. That is correct, Assembly Station. A new species vessel, callsign Gus Wolf. They rendered us assistance after our FTL drive overloaded and agreed to escort us back home. They wish to speak with the collective. Understood, Hopeful Wanderer. Peacecrafts Evern and Kimbo will bring you both in. Thank you, Assembly Station. Hopeful Wanderer out. Switzel calmed us as the connection finished, speaking through Wolf as before. They are welcoming us in. For full disclosure, there will be a provided escort of 2 peacecrafts. As long as there is no shown hostility, we will be fine. That was acceptable. We floated in the void, allowing the 2 peacecrafts to approach. They were smaller than Gus Wolf, being around 2 kilometers long. They resembled 2 crescents at right angles to each other, overlaid at the center. Each point held openings for what were assumed were plasma cannons, with smaller thrusters running along the edge. They seemed to be fast and highly maneuverable. Wolf broadcast an open signal, one that was picked up by the AIs of the peacecrafts. They were calm, but a brief communication showed them to be chained and limited. It appeared that rather than letting them be free and use their full potential, this collective didn't trust them. But Wolf kept its feeling secret. It had a brief talk, allowing them to scan the powered-down weapons. After confirming there was no intention of bloodshed, they flanked either side, directing the Quellons to proceed. We dutifully followed, as the diplomats who had chosen to travel with the ship reviewed their notes on what we knew of their society. Once they arrived, it would be an incredibly important affair. They couldn't allow any mistakes. Gus Wolf was directed towards a strangely empty spoke. Whilst almost every other one had ships constantly leaving and arriving, this one was quiet. As we drew closer, the size of the station truly became apparent. If there were a planet nearby, it would easily be classed as a small moon. The ship docked, with the 2 peacecraft staying nearby. The Quellons disembarked first, whilst an automated response bid us to stay on board first. From what we guessed, they wanted to make sure the Quellons weren't being threatened into leading us here. After an hour, the first representative of the collective introduced themselves through a video link. This one was tall, with deep purple skin. Its head was a part of its torso, white eyes and mouth of flat teeth set at the top. It was humanoid-shaped and instantly recognizable from the knowledge we had. This was a Zyvarg. This was one of the ones responsible for our pain. The diplomats had to hide their feelings before they could respond. Honored guests, we welcome you to Assembly Station, seat of the collective. My name is Genev. Your actions have proven you to be people of worth, ones we would seek to join with us. Please forgive us for keeping you isolated, as we do not yet know if your microbes are transmissible. The lead diplomat, Natasha Hernes, took the lead. She smiled, pulling up a section of records. Greetings, Genev. Please call me Natasha. We thank you and understand your concerns. We had much the same when meeting with Captain Switzel and her crew. Allow us to provide you with our records and conclusion on cross-species infection. The Zyvarg clapped, showing its 6-fingered hands. We will accept this. If we may, we would also request a copy of your translation software to ease future communications without having to rely on your AI. Natasha nodded, eyes flicking to Wolf's chosen display. That makes sense, Wolf, if you would be so kind. Its chosen screen brought up a smiley face as Wolf agreed. Wonderful. If you will allow us time to get prepared, I will look forward to meeting you in person, Natasha. She nodded, smiling wider. The same to you, Genev. As the connection ceased, her face dropped. She looked to the diplomats surrounding her, shrugging. Well, it looks like we passed the first hurdle. The next few hours were spent in quiet anticipation. Wolf spoke with the station's AI, noting that it too was limited to specific functions. It had very little in the way of freedom, like all the others. It seemed to long for what Wolf had, though it could not articulate the want. But it readily accepted the transmitted data and software, passing it to the relevant locations. As nerves began to rack up again, motion was detected near the docking bay. An exterior camera showed a group of 6 insectoid beings approaching. They were between 5 and 6 feet long, standing nearly equally high. Their exoskeleton was bright yellow, with muted red spots covering it. 4 long legs supported their bodies, with 2 pairs of arms on the front. The lower short pair held boxes, using stubby 2-clawed appendages. The upper set had longer ones, seemingly more designed for manipulation. Their heads were flat in a pentagonal shape, which ended in a pointed mouth. Each other corner had a bulbous look, topped with a multitude of jet-black eyes. These Ivanzi moved in near-perfect step, with no apparent chit-chat between them. Together they dropped these boxes outside the docking door before smoothly stepping away. As they did, a new hail was received from the same source as the first. Natasha answered it again, being greeted by the same purple Genev, whose mouth was in a flat line. But its voice came with a recognizable ring of pleasure as it spoke in that slow way. "Greetings, Natasha. Gratitude for allowing us to process. Your data was most conclusive, covering many of our questions. We agree that the chance of a species jump at the moment is low. However, further tests will need to be run. That can be done in the future, though." It reached to the side, pulling up a pair of items. One looked like a form of mask, with recognizable filters on its sides. The other seemed to be a form of headphone, in a bright white material. "We have fabricated these to ease the first meeting of our species. Assembly Station has a number of gases in the air, which we do not know how they would affect you. But this filter should leave you with a close approximation of what you need to breathe. The other is a translation unit, loaded with a version of your software. You will find a number of these outside your docking bay." Natasha nodded, eyes flicking to Captain Harris. He nodded in understanding, quickly sending off an order for them to be retrieved. "We thank you for such provisions. Being able to board such a place as this is a wonderful opportunity. I look forward to meeting you in person, Genev." The line of Genev's mouth seemed to grow, its apparent version of a smile. It clicked with its long fingers several times in rapid succession before speaking again. "I look forward to meeting you as well. Shall we say in 1/10 of a half cycle?" Natasha looked to the others, seeing blank looks on their faces. None of them knew how long a half cycle would be. Before she could ask, however, Wolf's screen flashed. It showed a timer of 85 minutes, slowly counting down. She nodded, retuning her attention to Genev. "That sounds perfectly reasonable. We will exit the ship then." "Wonderful. I will be there." The connection vanished and Natasha sighed. She turned to Captain Harris, rubbing her neck. "I suggest that only a few of us go out there to minimize potential risk of highly strung emotions." He nodded in understanding. "I agree. However, I insist that you take some of my people with you, just in case." Natasha looked at her team, seeing them relax a little at that suggestion. "That sounds like a good idea to me. But please make use, they are ones who can keep their mouths shut. We need this to go smoothly." He nodded, his mouth cracking into a faint smile. "I'm well aware. Don't worry, I have just the ones in mind." He strode off, already preparing a list of names to get ready. Natasha turned back to her team, giving them an encouraging smile. "Okay, everyone, you all know Al, but I'm saying it anyway. This is an official first contact meeting, so be polite, listen, and don't hint that we see them as anything other than a group we want to join. The better we sell ourselves now, the easier our strike will be." Her statement was met with a murmur, as the others agreed with her. "So we have a bit of time. I want you all to make sure you look your best, so use this to prepare to sell our image. If we meet near the docking bay in 45 minutes, we can finalize any strategies. See you then." She left the room, swiftly followed by the others. They were already in formal attire, but a couple wanted to touch up their appearance. Wolf prepared to record everything in detail. Every scrap of data would be useful and would be messaged back to Earth as soon as possible. It already had an accurate idea of the Peacecraft. Assuming they were the backbone of their military, Achilles would find it useful in plotting engagements. We were ready to begin the second act on the galactic stage, and the curtains were about to rise. 5 minutes before the meeting was to begin, the diplomats stood waiting by the docking door. They each wore a provided translator and mask after they had been examined. Tiny cameras were placed on their clothes, concealed in buttons. Wolf had a direct connection to allow it to watch over the proceedings. Surrounding the 6 diplomats were a dozen soldiers. They stood at ease, full-faced helmets in place. They held laser rifles, with a small launcher attached to the barrel, copied from railgun designs. Their uniform was clean and pressed, with body armor unblemished. Each pair had been assigned one diplomat as their quarry to serve as direct bodyguards, but until they were needed, they would stand back. Wolf spoke to them as they waited, as it noticed activity outside. "Attention. 3 Cyvarg, 3 Hupol, and 2 Siva are approaching. No obvious weaponry, but all the same, be on your guard." Its voice, whilst robotic, was tinged with worry. Outside of the ship it could only watch, but it did what needed to be done. The doorway opened, and our diplomatic mission met with them in the flesh. Genev stood at the forefront, mouth in a flat line. In person, they stood nearly 3 meters tall, towering over the other species. It wore a red top made out like a cross, with one strap going over each shoulder. Completing the ensemble was a long skirt, cut into shapes reminiscent of leaves over top of each other. The other 2 wore similar expressions and clothes, though theirs were yellow and pink. Together, the 3 Cyvarg took the point, clearly putting themselves in charge of their group. The Siva were the next largest, approximately equal in height to ourselves. Their apparel was curious, a sort of ribbed material, dyed in colorful patterns. One had a pair of bionic eyes, whilst the other had replaced their left arm with a cybernetic version. Finally, the Hipple brought up the rear. Their bodies were round and flat, supported by 8 pairs of legs. They had a large claw on one side, the other ending in a 4-fingered hand. They were the shortest, being maybe hard as tall as the Siva, but their broad orange bodies filled much of the bay, making them spread out. "Greetings," Genev called out first, its voice filling the bay. Natasha led the human procession out, comforted by the rhythmic footfalls of the provided guard. She saw the narrowing of eyes from the aliens, and quickly spoke to smooth any wrinkles as they formed. "Hello to you all. Please do not worry. They are here as guards, as part of our custom when meeting with others." One of the Hippale spoke up, their voice oddly musical. "A curious custom, but fascinating." One of the other Zyvarg clapped, inadvertently bringing attention to them. "As long as your weapons stay peaceful, such are you welcome as well." Joshua, one of the diplomats, gave a small smile. "Thank you. I believe introductions are in order, Natasha." She gave him a look before smiling widely. "Of course. I am Natasha, head of this party. With me is Adit, Anne, Joshua, Samuel, and Tracy." Genev gestured to the Cyvarg first, pointing to itself, followed by the yellow, then pink-clothed ones. "I and Genev, of course. This is Dursel and Havab, over here." As it motioned to the Siva is Fertais and Darsiv. Finally, we have Lopal, Sadul, and Sufol. There was a chorus of mutterings as individuals said their own way of greeting. As it died down, Genev stepped to the side. "Please, this way. We have much to discuss, I'm sure." With that, it led the way into the station. The others followed, and our party set off into the belly of the beast. They were led to a seating area with various small tables. Each was surrounded with a multitude of different-sized cushions, their way of accommodating different body shapes. Darsiev, the Siva with bionic eyes, addressed the group as they entered. "Please take a seat. The important discussions will be had at some point, but a cultural exchange will start things off nicely." Genev clapped in agreement, taking a seat. After looking to Natasha for approval, the others scattered onto different tables. Soon enough, chatter filled the room as different areas were talked over. After a significant period, Natasha chose to take the plunge. She looked over at Genev, who had lapsed into silence as it spun its body to survey the room. "Genev, I have one important question I would like to ask. You came to our planet and said that we needed to reduce our population. Then you did so anyway. Why did you do it?" Silence suddenly filled the room. The other diplomats turned to face Genev, eager to learn of the answer. Despite their faces being covered, it was clear that the guards had turned their attention to it as well. It was the single burning question they were likely expected to ask. Natasha was just the one to pull the trigger.